But we'll start with introducing ourselves. So my name is Ewelina Wilkosz, and I work at Pragma as an IT consultant, continuous integration, continuous delivery. And I was working for Ericsson before for 6 years, and this is where my passion for, when I found the passion for continuous integration and automation. And this is where I've decided that I want to try the consultant life. And the tools I work with mostly at Pragma with my customers are Jenkins, luckily for me from the very beginning, as code, not as a plugin that we'll talk about today from the beginning, but there was some as code version. And Git and Docker, and I also had a chainsaw here because I'm pretty good with chainsaw, but no one really found this joke funny except me, so I had to remove it. And I treat continuous integration very seriously. And yeah, Nicolas asked me if he can quote me on this thing that you see now. I'm not going to repeat it.
Yeah, that's so we wanted you not to be nervous, being impressed by our super skills in Jenkins
anyway,
development.
I didn't know he's gonna quote me at the presentation, but well, I agreed. So that's me. And then Nicolas? And
so I'm Nicolas. So I used to be dressed like a panda or duck or whatever. So not this time. Sorry for it. So I'm working at CloudBees in the CTO office, so hacking various prototypes, and as Coach K was saying, I prototype config as code plugin. At the time we discovered Pragma was working on something mostly opposite, but with the same goals. So had to merge the code some way. Been contributing to Jenkins for 7 years. I'm also a Docker captain. And also making videos, so don't worry if you see my camera around. And I'm not the best guy in terms of CI and Git management, so I used to pretend everything worked at day one by using force push on GitHub.
And he's not allowed to do it anymore, and he still does.
Yeah.
But we all do, every now and then. Anyway, Kosuke helped us a little by introducing you to some Jenkins superpowers and the direction that Jenkins is going through. But I think we all agree and don't need much explanation on the saying that 2018 is as code, and the asterisk means like everything as code.
Yeah, so you manage infrastructure as code. I hope you do, and you are not still clicking on your VMware web UI. You probably all are using Docker files and all that sort of thing to manage your environment and install software. Probably your architecture itself, in terms of assembling bricks together, is some way managed as code. What I have in mind is Kubernetes deployment, Helm, and so on. And you know about CI/CD as code with Jenkins file. So I guess you have all those books at home. Not the last one because it doesn't exist. So if you want to write it, you're welcome. But what about the remaining parts? So we manage Jenkins infrastructure. We can create virtual machine, Docker cluster, whatever. We manage job configuration. We will see more details. And then comes Jenkins system configuration itself, how to set up your Jenkins master. And here it's not as nice as expected. For infrastructure, you have tons of ways to manage infrastructure, so you have tons of tools in Jenkins ecosystem. So Jenkins itself comes with a CLI, REST API. You also have binding for Python, Java, Golang, and probably more, so that you can do whatever you want. Various recipes for Chef, Ansible, Puppet, Docker images, all that sort of things, Helm charts. So there is no reason you can't install Jenkins. No, you can configure your jobs as well. So obviously with pipeline or job DSL plugin, if you prefer this approach. There is also job builder plugin in YAML, various people experimenting other ways to configure Jenkins. So I guess you know all about multi-branch Jenkins to just configure Jenkins with a Git repo. And job DSL is using, as the name claims, a DSL, domain-specific language, to describe your job, so you don't have to write XML stuff or just save. You just describe your job, something comparable to what you have in the web UI, but in Groovy. So here you have sorry, if you have a sample of the job with the SCM part, the triggers, the steps, the publisher, something that looks like a web UI express in code.
So there is a lot of things already covered. What was missing, kind of, like Costco also mentioned that a lot of people try to solve it in different ways, is Jenkins master configuration. And as an enthusiast Jenkins user, or actually Wikipedia could say it, Jenkins can be installed through native system packages, Docker, run standalone by any machine with JRE installed. That sounds nice, like you have a lot of choices. But it has to be configured manually, and that makes Jenkins enthusiasts Jenkins users not so enthusiast anymore. What I'm talking about is this form that you have to go through if you want to use Jenkins configured differently than the default one and a default configuration, and obviously you do. Yeah, and this is very short.
If you can't read in the back, it's by intent. The actual form is way longer, and yeah, and there is some administrators who used to live within this form all day long, changing parameters. So that's a job, but it's not really a pleasant job. So here we are.
So we don't always like that. It can be useful. It's a nice visualization. You can just go there and see what has changed. If you want to try something, you just click Manage Jenkins, Configure System, make a simple change, and you see how it's working, if you're brave. But anyway, it's not like we hate it, but we just don't always love it. So the goal of the Jenkins Configuration as Code plugin is to get rid of that. In a way, you're not forced to look at this page anymore if you don't want to. It will still be available on Jenkins, of course. So how do we solve it? There were people trying to solve it in different ways. I'm pretty sure a lot of you are familiar with init Groovy scripts. We have Scriptler, SCM sync configuration plugin. That is not your favorite? So there is maintenance problem for this plugin on one side, and the other aspect is that it manages your configuration as the XML storage. So it keeps history of your XML storage in a Git repo or Subversion repo. But yes, that's all the plain old XML. So any change that happens in your Jenkins master will just result in a bunch of XML file being pushed to repo without any knowledge of exactly why it had changed and what exactly was changed. So, yeah, this is an example of Groovy script. So it's not impossible. It's not like super complicated to use Groovy scripts. But if you're not a developer, if you're not very familiar with Jenkins internals or plugins internals, that may be something that you don't really want to do. So
yeah, it's actually extremely powerful, and lots of advanced Jenkins users are using it. And as a power tool, it comes with impacts when you do something wrong. And also, it's hard to explain your IT administrator who has to maintain Jenkins, Nexus, LDAP, server, Exchange, Outlook, tons of stuff, to also learn Groovy and Jenkins internals just to set up your Jenkins master. So not the easiest way. Yeah,
and so I mentioned a couple of slides before that when I started administering Jenkins, I had some kind of S-code solution, and the solution was based on Groovy scripts. And I loved it at the beginning. I didn't have to take screenshots of my configuration or my customer's configuration before making any change or saving XML files. I could just change the configuration file, try how it works, and go back if it breaks Jenkins. So that was great. But after a couple of weeks and months of using it, I've discovered that it has some pains. And the pains are supposed to be solved by Jenkins Configuration as Code plugin. That was the motivation for me and for my colleagues at Pragma to start working on a better solution. So we're gonna talk about those exact pains later. Again, going back to Koska's presentation, we're not alone. It's not like Pragma discovered this idea of configuring Jenkins as code. There was a lot of initiatives before. Some at Pragma, the one I mentioned, Jenkins as code reference. It's a repository. I think it's a nice library of Groovy scripts that you can have a look and use if you for whatever reason still want to use Groovy hooks. But there were others.
Yeah, so Koshike logged an issue, let's call it an epic, in 2015 about managing Jenkins as code. So it was a system config DSL plugin, which was mostly a prototype. I've seen last year Jenkins World many talks explaining how to manage Jenkins with sort of XML templating. Everybody inventing his own way to address this problem. We see lots of people with those groovy skills trying to share their recipes. So you see groovy bindings on how to manage security in Jenkins come with a groovy script that you use as init script with just few variables, so to make it simpler for adoption. And so Pragma prototype and the one I've developed at CTO office, so it was introduced to community last year during Jenkins World. But the code was so crappy that I can't make it public. It was really a draft mode, proof of concept. And so with lots of interest and collaboration with Pragma, we re-implement the same idea. So joining force.
Yeah, last year we joined the forces, and again, I don't remember who exactly contacted who, but we ended up having meetings, and by we, I mean representatives from Pragma and from CloudBees. We had an online meeting with Koske and Nicolas, where Koske presented his idea and his requirements, reasoning behind the project, and I had my list of goals prepared for the meeting, and I was like, when Koske was going through his points, I'm like, God, we have the same. It's gonna work. It's gonna work. We had some different focus. We, as a consulting company, had customers with real problems. They were using the Jenkins as code reference repository full of groovy hooks that I mentioned before. So we had some experience, we knew what was missing. We had a lot of parallel teams developing the same solutions because the fact that everyone had to clone or fork the repository meant the people were not sharing improvements easily, and we had the same thing implemented 3 times by 3 different teams. That was the main motivation for developing the plugin. And then CloudBees had the prototype that had slightly different focus.
Yeah, actually the difference is at CloudBees, at this time, we didn't have some concrete user of the project. It was just an idea. And what we know, based on, especially on the pipeline development, is that there is more than 1,000 plugins in Jenkins ecosystem. So if you would have to maintain binding for each and every of them, it's a huge effort. So we wanted to have something generic. That's really the theoretical approach. And on the other side, Pragma came with real customer, with real problems, with very pragmatic solutions.
And
so
I was ready
we have to find something in the middle.
I'm sorry, I was ready to develop support for those, like each plugin separately, until I found out it's like 1,600 or something like this. And then this magician like came with his idea.
So I have to reconcile the magic and the reality.
Yeah.
And so they end up on Jenkins GitHub organization. We have some long discussion on the name of the project, and it end up as configuration as code. Wow.
Yeah. We also use like a short version, JCask, every now and then. So that's it. I didn't know that the discussion could be so hot regarding the name, but it was. Anyway, we had the name, and we were using the Jenkins enhancement proposal mentioned the previous presentation that we will provide link to. Also, we're also like there was a lot of discussion what to put there, how to implement things. But I think the out-of-the-box support is the most challenging from the implementation point of view, but it's also the like very strong advantage of the plugin. So we wanted to make it as easy as possible for users. It's not that easy for developers, but yeah, the users are the focus. So briefly, how the Jenkins configuration as code plugin will work. You need to have a Jenkins YAML file It doesn't have to be called Jenkins. Whatever file in YAML format is an input for Jenkins configuration as code plugin that has to be installed on your Jenkins instance. And if you feed the plugin with the configuration file, whatever you have under manage Jenkins page, so not only configure system, but also global security, credentials, tools, this will be covered by whatever you put in Jenkins, in your YAML configuration file. So you don't have to go anywhere near manage Jenkins to have your Jenkins master fully working. And we also support basic job creation. So you can link existing job DSLs, you can put job DSL in the YAML file. So you really don't need to use hands at all to have your Jenkins up and running. Of course, like you need to use your hands to prepare your YAML at the beginning, but it's only once, and then you can reuse it. So that was the plan, and then we had to just made it.
Exactly. Just a word on job DSL support, but job creation support. So the idea here is not to save all your jobs, but to create some seed job that will populate your Jenkins master. And so the way I like to use it is to rely on job DSL to create a GitHub organization or multi-branch pipeline. So you just have this hook at startup to ensure that your Jenkins master is configured for your GitHub account. And then Jenkins discover all your pipelines. So in just a blink of an eye, you get everything CI set up.
Yeah. So that was the idea, how it will work, and then why you should even try it? What's the motivation behind
because it's cool.
Configuration?
Yeah.
And then so let's just ignore those. No, so it gives you some safety, like what I mentioned, like taking those screenshots. I don't need to take screenshots anymore. I can easily roll back to the previous version if I mess up something. Traceability. If someone breaks Jenkins and you keep your configuration file in some version control system, you can easily check who broke it, not to blame this person, but if it's not working, this person knows what he or she wanted to do. You can roll back and then re-implement solutions. So you understand, you can understand who and why is making changes.
Yeah, so the plugin itself don't manage the traceability. It only consume YAML. Sorry, it consume configuration file. It's up to you to manage this in a SCM repo or with chef recipes or Kubernetes config maps or whatever you like. So you can just plug whatever administrative solution you have.
Then the speed. Obviously, the plugin won't make Jenkins work faster, but it gives you an opportunity to put up your Jenkins faster. Like you don't have to go through configuration page anymore. If you want to duplicate your Jenkins, you can, like, once the configuration is there and you want to have very similar Jenkins or you want exactly the same Jenkins on your local machine just to test something before you're putting it up there, it's a matter of minutes or seconds if you're like super fast.
And also when you update configuration, which is important part when you want to experiment on your own with some configuration options, reloading config as code is just some tenths of a second compared to reloading a full Jenkins config that can be minutes. So very easy to just experiment. Oops, I broke something, roll back, and so on.
It's easy to use, we hope, with the documentation being improved all the time. It's just a very simple text file, basically, that you have to write. You don't have to write any piece of code. You don't have to be a developer, so it's like a low entry barrier. And easy to reuse, that I mentioned already. If you want to have a similar Jenkins, you just copy the configuration file. You maybe make a couple of changes, and then the new Jenkins.
And so as well, easy to share. The idea here is, for plugin maintainers, there are some of them in the room, that you can, within your plugin, have some documentation on the typical YAML sample for your config, and people can just copy-paste and use it as config as code.
Yeah, and I mentioned that there are some challenges from the developer point of view, and things we wanted to introduce to make it really easy to use, as we mentioned before. Yeah,
so we want something that human can read, which is obvious. Human can also read XML. But human can read Perl, you know. We also consider that the web UI is something like a natural documentation. That's how you discover Jenkins. So that's an easy way for a newcomer to just say, oh, there is this option in Jenkins. I didn't know about it. You can have documentation for sure, but if you see it on the web UI, you know it exists. So we want to have the same. We want to configure everything in Jenkins, including all plugins. That was Cloudbeast's goal. And support most plugins. So we know there is some corner cases, but without specific development effort for each and every plugin. And be able to generate documentation, validation tools, anything that can help newcomers to just adopt this approach.
Yeah. So here are details how we addressed some of those challenges. I already told you that we're using YAML as a configuration file format. Why we've decided to do that? Structured content, you don't have to know any specific programming language to prepare your YAML. It's readable and it's commentable. And the possibility to put comments in YAML was important for us. Especially if you work with different teams and you want to share your configuration file, you can just put some comments and then there is not much needed from you anymore if the comments are self-explanatory. Yeah. And then one important thing for me is that since I moved to Denmark, I got a laptop with Danish keyboard, and typing a curly bracket, it took me months, really months. And then I got a new laptop, and for some reason it came with Swedish keyboard. So we're there all over again. So nope, it's that's my motivation. Those are also important. And there is,
just a point here that the very initial version of config as code, maybe you can see some early slides, we were using all the features of YAML, including, so maybe you don't know, but YAML can do some inheritance, some maps, complex maps, and people just don't understand anything when you use it. So we reduce the scope to just key value. That's it, and lists, nothing much.
Yeah, so it's super simple, and there is really only one tool that you really need to write a proper YAML. And I don't know the name of it, but it's important. And I had some live demos that I'm prepared, it's going to work. And then I copy from one editor to some other editor, and indentations are messed up. And it's...
Yeah, clever editor that try to fix indentation for you. Woo.
No, so just beware of the fact that indentations matters in YAML. Then we have web UI as the documentation. Yeah,
so as say Obi-Wan Kenobi, no need for a Jenkins expert to do it right, because you know it. You use it on a daily basis. You see this option on the web UI, so you know it exists. You see this option in this specific section of the configure page, so you will try to replicate the same in your YAML file. So we try to mimic the web UI, and the way we do it is that the web UI is based on internal model in Jenkins. So we also can discover this from Jenkins to replicate. That's not, there is no internal file to say this option has to be here. That's something we dynamically discover.
Yeah. And that's an example of YAML, and well, obvious, isn't it? No, we'll elaborate much more on that. I will elaborate on that during the hands-on session if you want to participate. So that's just an example for you right now. We mentioned configuring all initial Jenkins setup, no hands. So fully working Jenkins master, including plugins and jobs configuration, can be achieved with Jenkins configuration as code plugin. That was the tricky one, support all plugins or most of the plugins.
Yeah, most is important here. We try to define a mechanism that will match all plugins which follow some conventions. Most of them do, some of them don't, just for legacy reason, because you know, Jenkins code base is more than 10 years old, so some people create plugin by copy-pasting, and they don't select the correct source for the copy. They use a very old plugin, so they are still using a very old construct. And some plugins have real weird design for weird reasons, and for those we need to provide what we call glue code, some adapter to follow the configuration API and adapt to some internals of various plugins.
And some of those plugins are really popular, and if you want to start using Jenkins configuration as code, you probably use some of those weird architectured plugins. So currently, temporarily, we provided this glue code for those like special implementation for those plugins, and we keep the code in configuration as code support plugin that you have to install if you want to use configuration as code with those plugins. What are those credentials?
Credentials, job DSL, and few others. The credentials is pretty obviously something you want to use, so we had to provide. The idea for this support plugin is to be sort of an incubator. Now with adoption of config as code, we expect this code can be adopted by the target plugins. So that's a temporary solution.
We hope the configuration as code support plugin will not exist forever. The plugins will like rewrite or like just adapt. Some of the plugins require minor changes, some are more complicated. But just be aware of the fact we're not dependent on this plugin, so it won't be installed automatically when you install configuration as code. You have to install it manually. Documentation generation?
Yeah, so as I say, you can just guess the YAML syntax. You have seen an example before, but you also need some documentation, some reference documentation, and also everything about ID, support, validation tools, all that sort of thing, and that's something we want to generate for you.
So yes, here come JCask, Jenkins Configuration as Code plugin that is addressing most of those.
All of those.
All of those, yes.
And even more.
Yeah. And it's still under development, but we have the official release out there. So where to find the plugin? We're talking. If you wanna have a look at the plugin, of course you can just go to Update Center in your Jenkins and install it, or use plugins install sh script in your Docker to install the plugin. But if you want to see how it looks inside, this is the link to the repository. And we highlight two Markdown files that I find very, very interesting. We have implementation details where the main idea behind the implementation is described, and guide for plugin developers. So we mentioned that not all of the plugins are supported yet. They may require some minor changes, and Nicolas will talk a little about the details of the implementation.
Yeah. So the idea of those two documents is depending how you want to contribute. Maybe you just want to fix some plugins, so read the plugin developer documentation, or maybe you want to really contribute Jenkins config as code core mechanism, and then have a look at the implementation details to understand how it works.
So it's time for demo. It's gonna be I had a Jenkins instance based on with configuration as code working, but I've decided to shut it down, so like to not cheat. I have my Docker files and Docker Compose ready. Again, I will show you exactly the setup I use at the hands-on session if you want to attend that one. And my configuration file is ready, so I just need Docker Compose app. And yes, keep your fingers crossed. And we can quickly have a look at my configuration file. It's very simple for now. This is the file that I will develop during a hands-on, so much more will appear here. So Jenkins is fully up and running. I hope you can see that here. And that's the one. So the only thing I configure currently with my configuration files is system message, number of executors, and like a label for this executor for master. So I'm going to change the system message, and I can just go to manage Jenkins. Once you install configuration as code plugin, you're gonna have a link under manage Jenkins page, configuration as code, familiar face, I hope. And we just use reload existing configuration button, and well, if the page reloaded, it means it worked. So let's refresh the page, and the system message has changed. So hello, Dave Jenkins.
Yeah.
Well.
So yeah, we were talking about speed. As you can see, when you hit this reload button, it seems nothing happened. So be prepared to click many times. And because what the actual design is mostly equivalent to submitting all the configuration forms at once, which will create some load on your Jenkins cluster, but just nothing more than few HTTP requests. Nothing compared to just rebooting the JVM or things like that.
So that was a very simple demo, but there is really not much more we can show. It's just that the way it is, the way it works. Of course, the configuration file will be much longer in most of the cases, and you will introduce more changes, but that's it. You change, I use the button. We have CLI commands that you can use to automate the process of reloading, and so there are different options. So how it works?
So the idea behind all this stuff is to take your live Jenkins instance, so core version, plugins and everything installed on your Jenkins, and to introspect, to create a data model to match your installation. And based on this data model, we can drive the YAML parser, we can generate docs, schema validator, and probably lots more stuff. We had in mind to have some linter, for example, some ID integration, if we can generate sort of a grammar for your ID. The idea here is that you come with a specific version of Jenkins, so we have tons of code here and various plugins with specific version. And so you have the Jenkins root instance with host some configuration, all the global configuration page for all your plugins, and some special component of ours. And based on this, we are creating a tree model of your Jenkins data. So what we do here is we try to understand how Jenkins is building its web UI. So when you see this, when you click the configure Jenkins link, you see this manage page with lots of links, including config as code itself. And we try to identify the component within this page to just discover what's next. And then we have a new set of components and what's next. And this creates this tree model. So as I say, we assume that plugins are following some rules so that we can discover them. Because we fully rely on web UI data binding. We have no idea how the XML files are stored. We don't know about the internal representation of things. We only see the same metadata exposed by component for web UI. The main benefits here is that this is a very simple way to ensure that if you see some number executor on the web UI, there is probably some number executor attribute on the Java class. And so we can discover this to reflect the web UI. So we have those two documents. We already talked about them. And once we have this data model, we can generate documentation. So here is a sample of the docs generated for the Jenkins root object. So it improved a bit in the meantime. We now have more links on available values, so you can really browse this documentation. As you can see at the bottom here, we include the tips that you have on the web UI. So it's not just a reference of available attributes. It's real documentation that explain what this attribute is for. The same information you have on the web UI. And we also generate a JSON schema if your YAML editor can support it. So corner cases, because some exist. Sometimes plugins, for various reasons, don't follow those conventions. And for them, we have some lower level API that plugins can implement, or that we implemented in the support plugin, to just allow you to use config as code without waiting for the plugin to be fixed, which could take ages. If we wanted each and every plugin to just follow our convention, it could be a bit harder. So how it works. So here comes the hard part. So to get some understandable explanation, I will explain how the parser works. So we'll start by the YAML, a sample YAML file. So here we only have text, right? So we know only two root elements, Jenkins and tool. And we need to find something in Jenkins that will match those keys. So here we have an API for this, root element configurator. So there is one for the Jenkins core component itself, and for every so-called global configuration that you have in Jenkins, mostly the managed links that you see on Jenkins config page. So Jenkins, so we have same for tools, security, and we have an uncategorized for everything else. There is many of them actually. All the config page of various plugins. So for example, Mailer or whatever. And you can also come with a custom one. That's the case for the credentials plugin. So now we have identified that the Jenkins starting element in YAML is pointing to the Jenkins class, right? And we have some sub-elements. So here, security realm and possibly many more. So we call them attributes. And the idea is that from the API point of view, attribute is just a name and a target type, which is the important thing. That we know we are configuring Jenkins as a Jenkins class, and we are searching for an attribute name security realm. So we will search for this field in the Jenkins class, and now we have a type. So that's not just anymore a string. We know the concrete class that we are trying to configure. So we have a setter for this. And here, security realm actually is an extension point, which means it's an abstract class. We can just create a security realm. We know to know which implementation of security realm has to be created. So here comes the magic. So you could just use the fully qualified class name of the implementation to be used. At the early time of Jenkins pipeline, so-called workflow at this time, you sometimes had to pass a fully qualified class name, which just was ugly as a user experience. And so was introduced the symbol annotation that just say my favorite name for this class is, let's say, LDAP. So some components already have this annotation. So the components that come with Jenkins core have them. And others haven't yet adopted symbols. And for example, if you have installed Active Directory plugin and LDAP plugin, for the security realm extension point, we have 4 candidates. Only 4 of them. So we just need to find names for them. So with symbol, it's easy. And for other, we just abuse the naming conventions that Java developer like, which is to have very long class names. So if you are implementing security realm in the LDAP plugin, the class is probably named LDAP security realm or LDAP security realm imp, sort of things. And so we can guess a reasonable name for your component. And that's how we know that LDAP is pointing to this specific implementation of the API. So here the databound constructor annotation is the web UI part that tells us using this constructor is the normal, the legitimate way to create this component. There might be other constructors for testing purpose or internal use that may not make sense to be used. But this one is the one used by the web UI, so it's safe to use it. And so everything we see as arguments are the required sub-elements. So we can just iterate on the other section of the YAML to see that the cache configuration is defined with TTL and so on. So in terms of discovering the API, there is lots of corner cases and backward compatibility issues. So we have support. By default, we don't support deprecated method or those marked by restricted with some internal stuff in Jenkins. So what we're trying to do here is to ensure that you get a clean model, but you have option to disable this check. And so you can still load your your configuration once a plugin has been updated and marked something deprecated. You still will be able to load your YAML configuration. You will just get a warning to say, hey guy, this specific argument has been deprecated and replaced by this one. So double check your YAML to stay up to date. So something in the middle, not saying, okay, we can load anything, don't worry. Just, okay, we can load, but you have something to do on your own.
And then you have to like configuration as code. So we said Jenkins configuration as code plugins support most of the plugins configuration. Also configuration as code
itself.
plugin.
Yeah.
So you can use configuration as code to configure configuration as code. Yes.
Yeah. Some inception model.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I won't get more into details, but here is a sample of the credentials plugin. So where you define your system credential with the global domain, so there is just no value for domain, which make it obvious that you need commands. And then credentials itself here is a SSH file on master. So here we have a custom credential root configurator, and we expect this to be adopted by the credential plugin at some point. Never mind. So status of the project.
Yeah.
So we even have 1.1.
That's the next slide.
Yeah.
So yeah, we released the first official 1.0 version last month. And we actually released 1.1 not that long time ago with very important security fix, so please upgrade. And the 1.2 is coming today.
Yeah,
Most
so
probably.
If you want to join the hackathon this afternoon, each of us who has the pull request merge will be part of 1.2 because we plan to release this at the end of the hackathon.
Yeah. I will just go back quickly to the previous slide. So we welcome feedback in whatever form you find it works for you. We are monitoring Jenkins users mailing list. We are using GitHub issues for now. Like not everyone is happy about it. We will have discussion about it. For now, Jenkins GitHub issues is a place to report your problems. But the most active channel is Gitter. I don't know if you're familiar with Gitter. If not, you just need GitHub account to be able to log in, and then you just join the room, and you can talk to us.
You have a link on the GitHub on the plugin site that you just the first element in the README is linked to the GitHub channel, and it's pretty active.
Yeah. So what are the features in the version we released? You can read the configuration file from your local drive, use REST API, CLI, or URL. More options are coming. We have reload configuration, what I just did during the demo. You can export existing Jenkins instance configuration into YAML. There's the same page I used to reload configuration, has an export configuration button, but it has a warning.
Yeah, so a big warning here is that some things works and some doesn't. Because being able to use the WebUI data binding to set up Jenkins is pretty obvious. Being able to replicate the construction of the web form by introspection is not as obvious. Something we want to do here is not to just dump everything Jenkins, but only to show you what you change versus the default setup of Jenkins. So that what you see is, if you have a fresh new Jenkins master, you click export, you should get an empty YAML. That's not the case. So we have some pending fixes in Jenkins core itself, which clearly hasn't been designed with this use case in mind, and for a few plugins as well. And so don't expect to just use an exported YAML on another Jenkins master, but you can use it to compare. Create an export, change something in the web UI, create another export, just make a diff, and you will see what changed, and so discover how to set up things.
And we've decided to release the feature anyway, even if you may end up with YAML full of stack traces, because it can give you some hints about what can be configured. You can just take bits and pieces from this YAML and build your own. So that's why it's there anyway. There is a warning on the page.
Yeah, so in YAML you have a stack trace to tell you this plugin we weren't able to export. And the full stack trace you can report on Gitter to tell us, hey, I get this one, and we used to know, we know.
Yeah. So since in the implementation we were not providing support for each plugin separately, we actually don't know which plugins are supported. We tested a number of plugins, and we know which works, which don't. But there is a number of plugins that for sure works. It's like just no one ever tried them. We know, though, that there are some plugins that won't work with configuration as code yet, and if you report a Jira issue with JCAS compatibility label on that plugin, it will end up on a dashboard. We will find a way to share the presentation with you, so you'll have all the links.
We also have started a compatibility document in the GitHub repo, which is empty so far. The idea here is that if you experiment with a plugin and it works for you, please just help us to have this list completed, to say, okay, this plugin works, checkbox.
Yeah.
That's it. And if you know that there is an issue, then link to the Jira issue, whatever. But yeah, that's if we have to do it by ourselves, it will take ages. So anytime you experiment with a new plugin and it just work, have just edit the ASCII.doc file to update this list. Thank you.
And then to make it easier for those of you that are not yet familiar with Docker, we have prepared this demo setup that we're going to use during the session after lunch, and I will explain it then. Here is the link to the Jenkins enhancement proposal mentioned by Koske, and if you're interested in why, more details about how we decided to do what and why not, have a look at this document. So please give it a try, report missing plugin support, broken feature. If you want to contribute, you can contribute with test cases. That's the little bit easier part. Fixes, not so easy. Just please don't report bugs. We've got it covered. So yeah, that's basically it. If you want to talk to us, just use the communication channels I mentioned.
All we are just here in front of you.
Yeah, that's too. But I strongly recommend Gitter as the most active and live one.